In this program, we are going to talk about pleasure. First off, we're going to discover the sources and functions of pleasure. Then we'll learn about some of the characteristics of sexual drive, ending with pleasures of a higher order. All religions codify pleasure. The Judeo-Christian moral code requests of its followers that they detach themselves from the material world. Human beings are on earth to strive toward their salvation, and all the pleasures they give up on earth will be returned 100-fold in the hereafter. But it's as if man has no choice. There are forces that compel him, almost against his will, to transgress the code and to satisfy his instincts. Pleasure sometimes comes to us when we least expect it. It urges us to do crazy things, even dangerous things. Pleasure plays an important part in our lives. It may even be essential for our survival. But what is pleasure, and what are its sources? Every living being is driven by a genetic program designed for its survival. This program is expressed in the form of impulses or drives, instinctive reactions, the first breath of a child, shelter for baby fish, a baby mammal's first nursing. All living organisms, from unicellular beings to human beings, are driven by the same life impulses: to eat, find shelter, and reproduce. It's by satisfying these essential impulses that man discovers pleasure. When a newborn baby is hungry, its stomach hurts, and it cries with all its might. When his mothers nurse him, at the breast or by bottle, the pain goes away and is replaced by an immense feeling of pleasure. By responding to this essential drive, babies experience the first of 3 successive phases of childhood erotic pleasures: the oral phase. They must suck to survive, and for several months they will relive that pleasure by putting everything within their reach into their mouths. Psychologists believe that it is mainly how our early childhood impulses were satisfied that determines our quest for pleasure in adult life. So a strong oral drive in a child can perhaps lead to that child's becoming a gourmet, a singer, even a smoker. At about 2 years, the anal phase begins. The child's muscles have developed. He now has better control of his body and can determine himself if he wants to hold or expel excrement. Individuals for whom the anal phase was important will enjoy handling and modeling matter. Next comes the phallic phase, when children focus on feelings of pleasure from their genitals. If these urges predominate in childhood, the adult may seek public recognition, perhaps by becoming a politician or an actor. While we can never be quite so categorical, our quest for pleasure will be affected throughout our lifetimes by those 3 phases of our childhood. The basis of our pleasures as adults lies in the fulfillment of our early childhood pleasures. During adolescence, the oral, anal, and genital drives come together to form what we call the libido. The libido is the vital energy that drives us to seek sexual relationships, but also personal fulfillment. During each phase of his development, man discovers pleasure through his five senses. From the moment he is born, along with the pleasure he gets from being fed, he is acutely aware of the stimulation of his five senses, feeling his mother's warmth, her smell, the sound of her voice, the look of her face, the taste of milk. From then on, for the human child, exploring the world will be associated with pleasure. This will translate later into the pleasure of touching, seeing and hearing, and tasting. His senses will also enable him to avoid pain and to learn how to survive. Once man's fundamental needs have been taken care of, education and social conditioning will enable him to control his primary impulses. He will then direct them towards satisfying other needs that eventually will lead to new sources of pleasure, whether learning, creating, or belonging to a group. But whatever form they take, pleasure and pain are inseparable and are vital to our survival. It's hardly surprising that man has always had trouble fully complying with moral ethics. Pleasure is often the confirmation of an act essential to his survival. Pain or displeasure acts the same way, but conversely. It warns us and teaches us to avoid anything that may endanger our body or our mind. We have never questioned some pleasures, such as eating, taking shelter, being warm. But sexual pleasure has often been condemned. Mind you, we cannot state that sexual pleasure is essential to our survival, and it's probably for that reason that a number of religions only allow it when it's connected to reproduction. The sexual act is, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful ways to be in touch with another person. It mobilizes us completely, with all our five senses and all our being. For any living organism to survive, it must satisfy two basic drives: eating and finding shelter. But for a species to survive, its members must respond to another drive, that of reproduction. Unlike the instinct of self-preservation, the instinct of reproduction is not connected to individual survival. But for man, as for other animals, response to sexual drive, whether in order to reproduce or not, provides pleasure. However, man has free will and may choose a partner with a certain physique. Confirmation, expression of the eyes. Our initial response to a sexual urge has as much to do with our perception of the other person's personality as with the image we have of ourselves, our mood, the self-confidence we feel. But is it always a case of free will? Scientists recently discovered that a hormone excreted by the brain called luliberin might be responsible for the passion of love at first sight. In fact, we don't always have control over quest for pleasure. Our senses perceive the outside world, and without our being aware, sensations make their way into our subconscious mind. Sensations are the fabric of our experiences, particularly those of early childhood. This fabric, made up of stimuli, is multi-patterned and can lead us to fulfill a sexual urge just as much as to seek a lasting relationship. Our search for pleasure involves not only the stimulation of our senses, but also considerations of a higher order that result from our social and educational development. Personalities don't have to be compatible. We can be looking for ourselves in the other person. At the same time, we may be looking for someone to complement us. Each partner studies the other, responds to the other's pleasure, and shares in it. Whether we are men or women, pleasure comes to us the same way. Our body's nerve endings send a surge of impulses to the various perception centers in our brain. Pleasure occurs when impulses are exchanged between the limbic system, center of our urges, and the hypothalamus, the main center of pleasure. Two bodies complement each other. Two mouths touch. He sucks on her lower lip, she his upper one. They breathe in each other's perfumed breath and drink each other's nectar. This text is not an excerpt from a modern book on sexuality. It is 14 centuries old and was written by a Chinese, inspired by texts dating back even further. Today we know that the stimulation of certain erogenous zones corresponds precisely to the 3 successive phases of erotic pleasure experienced in childhood: the oral, anal, and phallic phases. The sexual urge gradually causes an increase of tension in the partners. The tension is not unlike the creative drive of a painter or the stage fright experienced by an actor. During the sexual act, the tension is heightened by a stiffening of the muscles and a flowing of blood to the genital areas. The senses are hyperstimulated. To attain sexual pleasure, the psyche must also be free. During orgasm, the sensation of pleasure goes beyond the genital organs and pervades the entire body. The pulse rate can climb to 175 beats per minute. The pupils dilate to their maximum degree of opening, which explains why lovers tend to close their eyes. They are protecting them from too much light. Even the consciousness is altered, and for a few moments, one can feel out of touch with reality. Following an orgasm, the tenseness leaves the muscles. The brain secretes other hormones called endorphins, which put the lovers into a state of well-being and relaxation. For lovers, as for the hungry infant, pleasure is derived from satisfying an impulse. But eroticism is connected to all we have experienced since birth, to the development of our senses, and to our education. Our entire being is involved. There is no set pattern for sexual relationships. An infinity of nuances is brought to the relationship by the psyche of each partner, even though the pleasure of orgasm responds to a genetic program. It is evolution's legacy. The biological aspects of the sexual act have never changed. Mankind hasn't changed. However, the individual does evolve rapidly. Through education and socialization, we are able to vary our pleasures and to experience new ones. Have you ever watched marathon runners cross a finish line, completely exhausted? What do you think motivates them? They like punishment? Hardly. Any activity we do regularly and are successful at becomes a source of pleasure, even if it requires great effort on our part. These sources of pleasure ensure our psychological stability. Generally speaking, in modern societies, the drives that are essential to survival are satisfied. We can then turn to needs of a higher order. The need to belong, to be understood by those around us, to achieve self-fulfillment. The forms these drives take are closely associated with our early childhood. The pleasures they provide all have something in common. They all derive from a rise in tension. That tension will only be released when pleasure is reached. Then comes the relaxation phase. Then tension will grow again until it finds release. This cycle regulates the activity of all living organisms. Drives of a higher order are essential to man's psychological equilibrium, but their process is different for each individual. Two persons can experience the same activity with very different degrees of intensity. Whether a weekend painter or a passionate artist, both fulfill their aesthetic needs. A boat racing enthusiast, a solitary sailor crossing the Atlantic, both fulfill their need for adventure. The student who spends her day in a library and the committed scientists in their lab are both satisfying their craving for knowledge. For each one of us, fulfilling our needs gives us pleasure. But why do some of us require such extreme stimulation in order to experience pleasure?
Okay. Go.
Some psychologists believe this is related to individual sensitivity. In their view, some people have a lower sensitivity level than others. Thus, to attain the degree of tension required for pleasure to occur, they must have greater stimulation. A little like a deaf person has to turn up the sound of the TV to hear well, a racing car driver has to have the gas pedal to the floor in order to experience the thrill of speed. For these people, the sky is the limit. A number of scientists are studying the complex mechanisms of pleasure. They are examining how certain parts of the brain, the pleasure centers, react to extreme stimulation. By stimulating laboratory rats electronically, using electrodes implanted in their brain, researchers can recreate pleasure in these animals. For instance, a rat will activate a lever that triggers electric stimulations that give it pleasure up to 2,000 times an hour. Drugs seem to have a direct effect on the quest for pleasure. When a small dose of heroin is administered to a rat, its appetite for pleasure increases. It will then activate the electric stimulation lever up to 4,000 times an hour. The drug, therefore, provokes a greater need for the pleasure-giving stimulations. We might assume that in man, some addictions stem from a constant search for ever greater sensations of pleasure. However, people seeking excessive pleasures are often willing to jeopardize their lives to attain them, and in doing so, they negate their basic primary instinct, that of survival. We never satisfy our impulses of a higher order. These take root in the ways we experienced our childhood pleasures, and they become more and more complex as we mature. Today, there is virtually no limit to the complexity and sophistication of our pleasures. It's as if our fate was to always be seeking further, newer, better, beyond. But in actual fact, man's impulses haven't changed. It is the means that have changed. A cosmonaut en route to the moon satisfied the same need for discovery and adventure as Christopher Columbus did when he embarked for America. One pleasure we never tire of is the pleasure of knowledge. See you soon.